So it's raining in LA, and you'd think that it's just about the end of the world.
It's the end of the world as we know it.
But as I was sitting at my desk and hearing the rain, I got to thinking about weather. And so I want to talk about weather effects in your Dungeons & Dragons games. Hi, I'm Jeremy, I'm a writer, and this is my channel where I make videos about all things imaginary. Today, it's another episode in my series, Experience Gain, where I make videos about Dungeons & Dragons and how to get the most out of your role-playing games. Weather is an interesting tool in a DM's arsenal. I think it's something that not many DMs use, and I think it's something that also gets overcomplicated mechanically a lot of the time. The goal in today's video is to equip you with a better understanding of how to use weather in your games to have a really compelling narrative impact on the gaming experience that you're having with your players. Now, I have to admit, it's not something that I've done too often. It's actually something I feel like I've overlooked. But as I've been thinking about it and trying to figure out how I can use it in a way that's beneficial to the narrative experience of the games, I came up with a few ideas and a few thoughts that I wanted to share with you in this video. The first thing that we need to establish is, what am I talking about when I talk about weather effects? For me, weather is really two parts, and it all falls under the subcategory of the environment that you're playing in. Whether it's a city or a wilderness biome, weather is a consistent piece that always plays a role. The two parts I was talking about are passive weather and active weather. I consider passive weather to just be the state of the sky. I think that's a pretty simple way to break it down. So is it sunny? Is it cloudy? Are there some clouds or a lot of clouds? Is it raining, or is it heavily raining, or is it snowing? I think those are all the categories of passive weather. Active weather is a little more adversarial. This is where you get hail and powerful storms or heat waves. You might even also choose to include and consider natural disasters as a weather effect. Obviously, they'd be on the more extreme side, but something like a tornado or a hurricane can play a really interesting role in your games and is not a really commonly seen device in most role-playing games. There's not really a need to go too deep beyond that. I think we all understand what weather is, but why do we need to use it in our games? After all, most of our games are perfectly fine without weather. I think one of the major reasons that it's useful is to set tone. Specific kinds of weather are really simple narrative devices that you can employ as a dungeon master to give a certain feeling to a session or adventure of your game. In addition, there's also the mechanical component, which I think makes weather a really compelling tool to have in your arsenal that you can use to exhaust your players' resources or to confront them with an enemy that they can't just defeat with their combat skills. I'm going to dive into both of them a little more deeply, and I'm going to start with atmosphere. Now, when you start to employ weather to set your atmosphere, it's a really slippery slope, like world building. And the core thing, the most important thing to keep in mind when you use weather as one of your tools is that the fun is more important than the realism. You don't have to fully simulate a whole biome and have an elaborate chart of randomly generated tables to know the specific weather effect that's happening in today's session or in that day of the encounter. You don't have to roll a bunch of times if a bunch of time is passing in a session. If that's what you're into as a dungeon master, if that's what you want to do, sure, you can, but I think the goal and a better use of weather as a tool is simply to enhance the experience for the players, not to just create deeper systems for their own sake. After all, D&D is ultimately a narrative game. Even if the combat and the mechanics are a huge piece of it, it's the story that you guys collaboratively tell at the table, the one told between the dungeon master and the players, that's the most interesting and most exciting part of the game. It's not the mechanics themselves. At least that's what I think, and that's my philosophy on D&D.
Oh.
Now, that said, even if you don't have to take realism to the extreme, a certain amount of consistency is super helpful. And so in order to run weather well and to maintain the atmosphere that you want to construct, you want to be consistent in the weather that you're describing. I think the best way to accomplish both of these things, to have it, one, be consistent, but two, set a compelling tone, is to make a note to yourself in your game prep about what the weather will be like. That way you can easily refer back to it. You know what the weather is or has been in the previous sessions, and at the start of your game, when you're bringing your players back into the world and, you know, the conversations are dying down, everyone's seated around the table and ready to get back into playing, you can set the scene and spend one sentence describing the current weather. As far as the question of if weather is actually useful in setting tone, I think the use of rain in media is such a compelling example of this being done. If you want an example of how to use weather effectively, well, just think about any time you see a scary house in any piece of media. I think Scooby-Doo's a great example. If you see a haunted house, it's a lot more scary at night when there's heavy dark cloud cover and pouring rain and the flashing lightning and thunder, booming thunder of a storm than it would be during the day when it's a bright, cloudless, sunny sky. It's also just a key integral part of how we as people experience an environment. This does start to get into climate, and I don't want to spend a ton of time because I think that touches a little bit more on world building, but if your players are trekking through a desert, spending a little bit of time to describe the sky, describe the heat in the air and how it feels, I think that could be useful. If they're in a mountainous, snowy land, describing the snowfall, or if it's hailing, that's not time wasted. I think those are useful descriptors that help give your players an image of the place they're in and set the atmosphere for the session. One really simple way to think about it is to ratchet up how extreme the weather conditions are depending on how close to conflict your players are. If your players are just for the first time exploring this new zone, maybe the weather isn't that extreme, right? Maybe the heat in the desert isn't so blinding, or maybe the snow is only lightly falling in that mountainous landscape. However, if they're heading into the final boss battle and traversing the landscape before that major fight, then maybe you have a storm of hail or rapidly blowing winds that are kicking up sand all over the place, getting in between the player character's gear and caking them in this layer of sand that they have to wipe off as they step into the cave or the great underground temple that they've been searching for lives. I think it'll come to you naturally when you start to consider what the weather's like in your session and how it might impact your player's experience in-game. So that's atmosphere, and mechanics are really the next big thing. Again, the emphasis here is on having a simple and fun and evocative system, not something that's rules heavy just for realism's sake. D&D will never be a survival simulator. If that's what you want to play, there are other rule sets that are better suited to that than D&D. Of course, I'm not trying to say that your fun is wrong. You can do whatever you want, but I think you'll have the best time if you use the rules of D&D as they're intended and are careful in how you add to them.
Why is it whenever I'm having fun, it's wrong?
If you start giving your weather a mechanical impact, there's typically two forms that weather starts to take. It either functions as a challenge for your players or as a modifier on the adventures they're already going on. If you use weather as a challenge, this sets it up as an obstacle for the players to overcome. This is the really simple man versus nature core conflict that we should all know. However, I don't think it's something that gets used too often over the course of a Dungeons & Dragons game. Typically, if there are any natural encounters, I think most players have them come from the fauna or from plants or beasts that are somewhat mindless. Or you might have your players getting lost in a really dense forest or out at sea. Weather, however, can be a lot more confrontational. If your players are trekking through an environment with a heat wave or a heavy storm, you might force them to make survival checks or constitution saving throws to make sure that they remain strong enough to endure. If they fail, they might suffer a level of exhaustion. Levels of exhaustion that they do not recover as long as they are in those environments. D&D applies those rules to some of the otherworldly planes, but there's no reason you can't use that sort of check in an extreme weather condition, but that's a more natural, non-magical environment. You can even do certain things like making it so that your players don't recover hit dice or don't recover as many hit dice or hit points over a short or long rest as they would in a normal environment, as long as they don't have the appropriate gear for the environment they're in. So that might be heavy furs or winter clothing for a winter type environment, or the appropriate water and rations for a desert. And as you're making weather a more active and pronounced part of your games, you can even start to build in other environmental effects that would make sense. For example, after a massive snowfall, an avalanche might occur. And if you've set up that snow is falling and building up and that it's getting heavier and heavier the further up that your players are going in this mountain range, having an avalanche is a perfect payoff to that time that you've put in setting up the environment that your players are in. Whereas challenges confront your players more actively, modifiers instead impact whatever they're doing and allow the weather to have an effect without being the main adversary that your players are contending with. The heavy snowfall that we're talking about might cause every place that they go through to be considered difficult terrain if they need to trod and actually step through the snow more heavily. On a micro scale, in an encounter set in this environment, because of the heavy snowfall, you might actually treat the whole battleground as difficult terrain, or in a macro scale, you might just slow down the rate that they're able to progress through a map.
If the mountain defeats you, will you risk a more dangerous road?
Alternatively, they may just directly impair the character's combat abilities. For example, you might decide that storms and strong winds should cause players to roll ranged attacks with disadvantage. The effects don't have to be negative, of course. By that same token, even if they have disadvantage, those strong winds might also allow the players to shoot at a further distance, increasing the base range that they can roll with. Heavy rain or snow could also make perception checks more difficult and impact the difficulty of tracking someone. In snow, they might be easier to find because their footprints would leave deeper imprints. But in rain, all traces of them, whether it's smell or footprints in dirt, would get washed away. Fog is another really compelling effect because it can limit all players' visions regardless of whether they have dark vision by just shortening the range through which they can see. However, a positive twist on an effect like that can also make it easier for your players to stealth around if they're trying to stay out of sight. If you do decide to use weather conditions, making sure that you're balancing negative and positive effects is really important. It's completely likely that your players may get frustrated dealing with these effects, partially because they haven't dealt with them before, and partially because you're impairing them with something that's not directly confrontational. It's a lot easier to justify fighting a beast that's directly threatening you because you know you can take it out, but there's not much that you can do about the weather short of a control weather spell, which you don't get until much higher levels. And if you're doing all this with your mindset on having fun and making the game more compelling, there's no reason that the ranger in your party who's been impaired by this can't at some point over the course of their adventures learn or be trained to shoot normally despite whatever weather conditions are going on. If you're playing a heroic game where your players are playing characters that are meant to be very capable, that's an awesome reward for a player. They get to shoot normally when storms and massive winds are blowing because they're just that good, whereas normal archers don't, and the enemies that they're firing against are getting impaired by the wind, but for them, they just get to benefit from the range bonus. Ultimately, those kinds of narrative opportunities, that's why I like weather, and that's what I look for in rule systems. The weather rules that we've discussed, I think, force you as a dungeon master to be more flexible and also encourage your players to play more narratively rather than be too focused on the metagaming. It's a different style to play, and it may take some adjustment. It might take some adjustment for me, but it's definitely something I'm interested in exploring more. I love the idea of a wall of fire not necessarily being as effective if it's raining heavily. As long as you make the possibility of those kinds of interactions clear to your players, then going in, they shouldn't be too frustrated when you explain that. It's a little more work as a DM, but I can imagine it being much more immersive. And if that's the stick, then the carrot might be that during a lightning storm, if a wizard casts the lightning bolt spell, you might give an extra damage die of inspiration to that spell because the character's playing according to their environment. If you go through the trouble of setting the scene and making the game more narrative, reward the players who engage with that with inspiration. And it's not just the players who are going to get to have fun with this. As a DM, once you start to use weather as a tool in your arsenal, you can also start to consider other more interesting ways to play with it that won't necessarily come up all the time, but could lend themselves to really cool encounters and really memorable moments. For example, why not have acid rain that's actually acid? It could corrode weapons or armor or just be a very big problem for a local city and take your players by surprise. You could do something like an elemental flood where the weather is part of some sort of magical ritual to summon elementals or elementors. Elementors are elemental dementors. That'd be pretty rough.
How?
An elemental flood could be a surging wave of water that actually carries water elementals in with it, or a thunderstorm that actually spawns thunder and lightning elementals. If your players are on a quest for a hidden magical realm, why not also have a strange rain that seems magical in nature, and when it touches the player's skin, they discover that this is actually a rain of healing potions. It might move rather quickly, but if they're quick enough, they might think to bottle it up, and that's a cool and different way for them to restock on a healing potion. Again, these are more one-off ideas, but I just wanted to mention some of them to illustrate the possibilities that using weather more frequently will put in your arsenal. If you want to get deeper into the subject, there's a couple references I suggest that you check out. First of all, check out the Control Weather spell. The Control Weather spell breaks down weather in D&D terms. They've gone through the trouble of building out essentially a set of tables for you through that spell that you can take a look at either for inspiration or to add more complexity to the mechanical side if that's what you want to do. In addition, the Wilderness Survival entry on page 109 of the Dungeon Master's Guide also has a ton of info that I think will help you tie in weather into a sort of cohesive ecosystem for whatever environment that you're running.
It really works!
I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it interesting and got some useful tidbits to use for your game. I guess we should have more and more reasons to be glad that it is raining in Los Angeles. We can always use the water, and now we also got a video out of it. If you did like the video, make sure you subscribe. I make new videos every week. They're not always about D&D, but they're always about nerdy topics, and I'm trying to get better and better. And if you're already using weather effects, or if you've had interesting experiences with weather in Dungeons & Dragons or in other role-playing games, leave them in the comments below. I'd love to read about them. All right, with that said, I'm out of here.
So be it.